Okay, so today we're talking about Chinese and Japanese influence on Western design, primarily in the 19th century. This is another historical lecture. It's one that is important for both the British arts and crafts movement, but also the French Art Nouveau movement a little bit later. So it's kind of a historical context for both of those. We're going to start with the terms, right? So the terms for this influence are chinoiserie and japonisme. These are both French terms that refer to um, multiple facets of this issue, right? So they refer not only to the Western fascination with the decorative arts of China and Japan, but also the art itself, and also the copying of those decorative arts by Westerners. So all of that is kind of bound up in these terms. And traditionally, it's been thought about, okay, well, why were they so popular? And to some degree, we see that both Chinese and Japanese art were copied for its exoticism, for something new and different and exciting. Um, but Japanese art was eventually more studied for its underlying formal principles, and was taken up by both fine artists and decorative artists, and so we see that it's a little bit more influential in the end. For both, this is was seen as really refreshing in the face of the more traditionally sort of neoclassical or neo-Gothic, um, kind of art movements of the time. So that was a key part of its appeal. Let's start with China and a little bit about the history of China's relationship to the West. So, for a long time, China had been pretty consistently trading with the West, as we'll see in a minute. But in 1840, we start to see the British, kind of move into capturing parts of their territory. So in 1840, the region of Canton was captured, and then it's in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking that Hong Kong is ceded to the British. Creating historical effects that continue today. And then also part of that treaty, 4 ports on the Chinese mainland, including Shanghai, were open to foreigners. And so we see, more exchange. And then in 1860, Peking was taken, and the Chinese imperial palace there was looted by the armies of England and France. And a lot of that stuff, a lot of those looted objects, came back to the West and were either sold or put into museums. So, for example, the Empress Eugenie in France created the Musée Chinois, the Chinese museum there, filled with many of these looted goods. And, as you can see in the map, the imperialism in China map, there's lots of invasions by different Western powers over the years, and even Japanese later on. So it's a complicated history, but this is sort of the most salient for what we're talking about today. I wanted to talk about Chinese blue and white porcelain especially, right? Because this is probably the most common form and the most valued form of Chinese export, in the West. And this starts early on, right? Even in the 17th century, in the 1600s, as early as the 1600s, blue and white porcelain was specifically made for export, right? It's not just made for their own use, but it was made to send to Europe. It's a blue pigment using cobalt oxide that's made possible by the export of cobalt from Persia to China. And we see that these dishes, right, these blue and white dishes were also known as crack porcelain, and that's because of it's the Dutch name for caraca, or the Portuguese merchant ships that often were the ones who were doing the trade. And the characteristic features of these kinds of plates, again, made specifically for the West, were that the decoration was divided into panels on this wide border, and there's a central scene that kind of depicts a sort of stylized landscape. So that's sort of the most common form it took. Here we see also a Chinese export porcelain taper stick, essentially a candlestick holder, right? And these are both, by the way, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And what they found was that there, in Japan, in China at the time, there was no such thing as a candlestick holder, right? Like that's not a thing that they really used. And so what they found was that the Westerners who were importing stuff from China like this would send China examples of things that they wanted them to do in their blue and white porcelain, right? So they would send examples of candlesticks over to them and essentially say, can you please make this in your porcelain, system? And then the Chinese would send this stuff back, right? And so it's just an example of how they're very consciously creating things for the Western market. But then we also see a lot of examples of, for lack of a better word, cultural appropriation. Here we have, for example, the banqueting room of the Royal Pavilion at Brighton in England. This was designed for the Prince of Wales by Robert Jones. And we see that it's actually a pretty good example of eclecticism too, because if you look at the outside of the building, the exterior is more sort of like Persian/Indian, and then the interior of the building has all kinds of different styles, including this banqueting room, this sort of big dining room that is, meant to look Chinese. And they start with this sort of Chinese wallpaper, and then they kind of go from there, right? It's set into all kinds of red and gold designed things. And I'm going to try to put a link up to a 360-degree tour so you can really look at it and see it. But just the kind of like intensity of the design there is pretty astounding. And I think there's an example here of the ways in which exoticism is a kind of luxury, and there's something a little bit what's the word? It's sort of prescient, it's almost like they knew that they were going to kind of go in and take over China eventually. All right, so let's then turn to Japan, which has a little bit more of a complicated history in terms of its relationship to the West. So, in the 1500s, there was some trade with Portugal, and with that came a bunch of Catholic missionaries, and we see that by 1614, the Japanese are really tired of the Catholic missionaries trying to convert, their people to Catholicism. And so they expel all Catholic missionaries, and pretty soon they expel all foreigners totally, right? And so that there's basically no foreign trade at all with Japan, with the West, for over 200 years, from 1639 to 1853. There's no contact, right? So the borders closed, no contact. Finally, in 1853, there is an American who takes a bunch of American Navy ships. His name is the Commodore Matthew Perry, which I think is funny, but nevertheless. And he takes this sort of fleet of U.S. Navy ships over to Japan, and in a speak softly and carry a huge fleet of warships way, forces Japan to open up to trade with the West. And so America is the first one, but quickly Great Britain and France and other countries also create the first sort of treaties for trade with Japan. We see that Japan then eventually starts participating in some of the World's Fairs, right? It's, of course, not at the 1851 Crystal Palace World's Fair because that was before, 1853. And they really start participating in 1867 at the Paris World's Fair and continue thereafter, right? So then we see the development of the Meiji era, which is, often considered Japan's sort of Victorian age, right? It's when it really sort of blossomed and became much more open to the West and to Western ideas. And so we see just a lot of goods flooding in from that region. And we start to see the development of sort of stores or boutiques or galleries. It's hard to really classify what exactly these places were because they sort of functioned as all three. And in fact, they also, became not just stores, but sort of centers for knowledge about Japan, right? And the exchange of ideas on Japanese art and crafts and design. And so the two kind of main ones were Arthur Liberty's store in London and Siegfried Bing's boutique in Paris. And those both opened in the 1870s. Siegfried Bing in France also not only opened this gallery that was dedicated to Japanese art in 1875, but he also published a journal on Japanese art, right? Or it's called Artistic Japan or Le Japan Artistique, which ran 36 issues from 1888 to 1891, and it was published in English, German, and French, right? So in 3 different languages. And this, was really important in helping people learn more about the culture, learn more about the design. It was really sort of an educational venture, as well as, of course, helping him sell Japanese art. One of the famous kind of cultural commenters in France at the time was Edmond de Goncourt, who was actually part of there were 2 brothers who often worked together, Edmond and Jules de Goncourt. And so he talks about this phenomenon, right? The Japanisme phenomenon. And he says, "It is strange, this revolution brought by Japanese art in the taste of people who, in matters of art, are the slaves of Greek symmetry, and who suddenly are becoming impassioned over a plate on which the flower is not set dead in the middle, over a fabric in which harmony is not achieved by a gradation of tints, but by a knowledgeable juxtaposition of raw colors." And what he's getting at there is really interesting because it's really speaking to this one of the main reasons why there's such an influence from these cultures. And the main thing is that they had developed an artistic style outside of the Western tradition, right? They weren't bound to the rules of Greco-Roman naturalism the way that Western art was, right? That was the whole way of being. And so coming into contact with an art that didn't follow those rules and yet was just in their minds like just as interesting or aesthetically pleasing or whatever, that really opened their eyes to sort of new possibilities, and there's a lot more freedom to break with the Greco-Roman kind of naturalistic tradition that had so been part of the Western art experience for so long. And so there's an importance there of coming into contact with something so new. So what are some of the things that they looked at that we know for sure? One of the things is Hokusai's manga, right? So Hokusai is an artist, and when we think about the word manga today, we often think of graphic novels, right? That's sort of what we call them. But the literal meaning of the term manga in Japanese is however, it's like, to translate it, it would be something like curious or whimsical drawing, right? And this was more than like 19th century understanding of the word. And so Hokusai made something like 300 spontaneous drawings that illustrated his personal theory of art. And his students arranged these kind of random sketches into kind of specific kind of page designs that were then carved into into woodblocks for printing. The first volume was published in 1814, but after that, 14 additional volumes of the manga were published over the next 64 years, right? So it was very prolific, lots and lots of these little drawings. And as you can see, there's not really a lot of writing, it's really basically just different little sketches. And it shows people performing mostly like everyday activities. We see them, you know, not really on a horizon line. There's not a strong sense of space in the work in terms of, again, our expectations of a Greco-Roman system of like linear perspective. Instead, they're just kind of like arranged along the page, and other volumes have animals, birds, bugs, landscapes, details of, flowers and leaves and stuff. These are lots of different volumes of these things. Now, sometimes, at the beginning especially, these were just copied directly, right? Without there being a whole lot of intellectual property rights during this period, we see just like wholesale copying. So if you look at this plate by this French designer, it is copying the rooster from Hokusai's manga, like line for line. The same thing is true in this coffee pot by Edward Chandler Moore for the Tiffany and Company, the one that makes the jewelries with the little teal boxes. That company had opened up a branch in Paris, and so from 1860 it really specialized, that branch in Paris specialized in Japanese styles and motifs. And so we see the use of the dragonfly, for example, on this set. But eventually we start to see not straight copying, right? Instead, we start to get people who are really interested in some of the underlying formal principles of this Japanese art and design, and become much more interested in kind of thinking about it, again, more formally or intellectually. And I want to bring up this example, right? So these are two vases by a British guy named Christopher Dresser. And he actually goes and visits Japan in 1876-77 himself, right? And it really sort of has a profound effect on his design. So I want to kind of look at this before and after to give us a sense of, what's involved. So let's start with the before, right? Before he visits Japan, he has this idea that the ornament must tend to emphasize the beautiful quality of the object and not destroy the form, right? So, and this is a picture of him and the quote from him. And he starts out by having designs that are much more sort of about ornament that's on the surface, right? And yet he's already thinking about, okay, well, how can we make the ornament not seem to sort of obscure the thing itself? And so if we look at this vase, we see that the sort of bulbous shape of the vase is mimicked in the sort of bulbous forms of the kind of larger print, right? Those kind of curlicues that come down sort of mimic that same shape. And then the neck of the vase has these sort of longer vertical lines on it that emphasizes the beauty of the neck, right? And so we see that there is his attempt here, even with surface ornament, to kind of work with the form itself. But then he goes to Japan, right? He visits there himself. And you can imagine that this is not an easy journey, right, at this period. So he's pretty dedicated. And then when he comes back, he integrates some of his ideas even more, right? So, um, and I think we have this other quote by him to give us a sense of, okay, well, how is he thinking about this? And he says, I have sought to embody chiefly the idea of power, energy, force, or vigor, and in order to do this, I have employed such lines as we see in the bursting buds of spring, when the energy of growth is at its maximum. I have also availed myself of those forms to be seen in certain bones of birds which are associated with the organs of flight, and which give us an impression of great strength. Right? And so what is he saying there, right? And how does that translate to this thing? Essentially, the shape of this picture is trying to convey the expressive force more so than just the design on the surface, right? So he talks about this kind of the way in which this vase has this almost like uplifting quality, right? It's sort of moving upwards, and that kind of symbolizes that idea of the growth of spring, or the flight of a bird, kind of taking off. And so it's a little bit more of a more holistic approach to design, where the form and the decoration become inseparable, right? It's not just an ordinary vase that has a decoration on the surface. He's trying to kind of have the form itself embody that expressive force. We also see him experimenting with kinds of crazy designs that are really unusual for the 19th century. And I just wanted to throw these in because these are probably the things that's most associated with him in some ways, and yet they're probably mostly because they're the most eccentric thing that he did. But anyway, he comes back and he decides to play around with silver plate, which is, electroplating is basically when you can bond silver particles to a base metal and make something look like it's made of solid silver, but it's not. So it's a similar process to veneering, essentially, for furniture. And so, you can make these kind of relatively cheap products that look like they're made of silver. And because that they're not that expensive, these silver plate companies kind of let him play around with these more sort of adventurous designs, and they are startlingly original, right? That they don't look like your traditional sort of British teapot, right? When I think of that, I often think of like Mrs. Potts from Beauty and the Beast, but instead they have these kind of like stark geometric designs that we think of as much more, a 20th century phenomenon, but this is all the way back in 1879. So just wanted to kind of throw that in there. It's a sort of unique thing that he did. Probably the most influential and the most famous works of Japanese art and design from this period are the ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which are essentially made by, carving or chiseling the artist's design into wood, and then for every color that you use, you need a different block of wood, right? And you would sort of line them up carefully so that the registers would work out. But essentially, that's the idea, right? And beyond that, the ukiyo-e refers to not just the technique of woodblock printing, but the subjects that they would print about, right? Which was essentially the everyday life, fashions, and entertainments of Japan. And there's an author, a Kyoto author, who talks about sort of what this word means. And he says, living only for the moment, turning our full attention to the pleasures of the moon, the snow, the cherry blossoms, and the maple, singing songs, drinking wine, and diverting ourselves, just in floating, caring not a whit for the poverty staring us in the face, refusing to be disheartened, like a gourd floating along with the river current. This is what we call ukiyo-e. So that kind of gives you a sense of what kinds of subjects they would they would often use. And it becomes super influential to many sort of fine arts movements, including especially the Impressionists, which we'll talk about in a second, the French Impressionists, but also the British aesthetic movement, which we'll also talk about in a minute. And what they found in these prints, again, is contact with a style of image making that doesn't have to follow the rules of Greco-Roman naturalism, right? So they found sort of unusual compositions, elongated pictorial formats, asymmetrical compositions, using alternative or tilted perspectives, lots of aerial sort of perspectives and mixed perspectives. Spaces that are emptied of all but the most sort of abstract elements of color and line, so that we see, for example, flattened color without a lot of chiaroscuro or modeling effects, right? There's not the transition from light to dark that we normally associate with sort of Western modes of representing form and volume. And instead we see quite flat colors next to each other, and that line more commonly is used to define form. So there's a lot of use of silhouette and black outlining in these sorts of compositions. So these are examples of probably the most famous three, names: Utamara, Hiroshige, and Hokusai. Right, Hokusai's The Great Wave is probably the most famous of all of these compositions. It's on, sort of coasters and mugs and umbrellas and everything, right? But just to kind of give us a sense of what are some of the common and most famous images. And like I said, they're really influential to the Impressionists, the French Impressionists, not only in the style, but also in the subject matter and in the seriality, the idea of doing something over and over again. So, for example, excuse me, Monet is inspired by Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji, which he did showing the volcano in lots of different weather conditions at different times of day. And that inspired Monet's sequences much later of paintings of haystacks and water lilies and whatnot. And we know that Monet frequented Bing's shop, right, where a lot of these were being sold. Here we have Degas' Bathers, right? Again, this idea of seriality, painting the same thing over and over again. We also see, that this is influenced by Hokusai's manga in terms of seeing, again, these sort of subjects of the everyday, but also in the playing with perspective, right? Because in the manga, we're sort of looking, up and then down at the forms, at the figures, which is similar to some of Degas' compositions as well. Mary Cassatt was a good friend of Degas, and she saw an exhibition of Japanese prints at the École des Beaux-Arts that was arranged by Siegfried Bing in 1890, and he displayed something like 700 prints there. And again, this is a big deal that there was an exhibition of these kinds of prints at the École des Beaux-Arts, which was like the main school of art in France at the time. And in response, she produced a series of 10 aquatints, and here you can see 2 examples of them. And I wanted to have us look at the kind of comparison here between Utamara's image of a mother and sleepy child and Mary Cassatt's image of the bath. And there's startling similarities here, right? Both have eliminated, for the most part, the use of a kind of modeling of color in order to create volume. Instead, we see that line is used to convey shape, especially on the figures, right? We don't see, any shading in the face or on the body to convey volume in that way. We also see that she has picked up this idea of, creating a space that seems that doesn't have a lot of signifiers of three-dimensionality, right? The only thing that really conveys space in her image is this one line from you can see on the right, from the back of the mother to the side. That's the only thing that conveys a sense of like a floor line, right? It's almost like she can't help but putting that in there. But otherwise, they're in this very kind of, amorphous shape. So these are some ways that we see the influence on the French Impressionists. We also see in England that the aesthetic movement becomes really a popular way to, an expression of this interest in Chinese and Japanese aesthetics. So this is primarily a British movement, in the sort of 1870s, 1880s is probably at its height. And unlike the kind of reform movements in England, they're less about reform and standards and more about sort of inspiration and expression, right? They're very much following the motto art for art's sake. And they advocated for this real unity of fine and decorative arts, particularly in this idea of really eliminating the hierarchy between the fine and decorative arts. So, for example, in the academies at the time, it was really common to suggest that painting and sculpture, for example, was more important and more valued than sort of graphic design or pottery or glass making, any of the other sort of decorative arts. And they wanted to kind of eliminate that sense of hierarchy and essentially create this sort of space in which they're sort of equal stature. One of the things that they also did was create these interiors as total works of art, right? Every part of the design really works together to create this unified expression, from the fabric to the lighting to the furniture to the fixtures, right? The doorknobs, like literally every part of the room is designed to create this one expression. Like I said, heavily influenced by Japanese and Chinese non-Western arts and crafts. One of the things that's complicated about some of their imagery is that they often depict women as decorative objects, right? That along with the stuff that they include that's from China and Japan, especially in their paintings, women are sort of just one of those many decorative objects. And the style is often considered quite feminine or sort of effeminate. It's both a literary and an art movement. The major figures are Oscar Wilde, who's, of course, the playwright, poet, and James Abbott McNeill Whistler. Oscar Wilde, of course, like I said, known primarily for playwriting, but he was also kind of a bit of an art critic, right? And during a well-publicized lecture tour in the United States, he stated famously that an easel painting, right, a traditional painting, was no more spiritual, and in his mind, therefore no better than a well-crafted painted vase or a decorative tile from Damascus. And this was meant to be, this is kind of a revolutionary statement, right? Saying that painting and, a vase or a tile, like it's the same as having, oil on canvas. And each, he said, quote, is a beautifully colored surface, nothing more, and affects us by no suggestion stolen from philosophy, no pathos pilfered from literature, no feeling filched from a poet, but by its own incommunicable artistic essence. And, with that lovely alliteration, essentially what he's saying is that paintings, and this is really true of the aesthetic movement in general, this belief that paintings don't have to be a moral, right? They don't have to tell a story. It doesn't have to be this philosophical or literary or poetic thing. It can just be a beautiful image, right, without having to be these other things. So looking at some images, right here we have a painting by Monet and another one by the American painter William Merritt Chase, in which we see, again, women kind of in these Japanese and Chinese outfits and images. It was also really common to have artist studios filled with these beautiful objects from, all over. And so here you can see some painters incorporating images of their studios and women specifically sort of looking through some of the things in their studios. So for example, in the Whistler image on the left, we can see that he collected blue and white china as well as Japanese pottery and prints and screens, and that his mistress, Jo Heffernan, is kind of silhouetted there, sort of looking through some of these Hiroshige prints. And so, again, kind of creating this idea of the artist studio as a place of, filled with these exotic treasures. Probably one of the most famous kind of interiors that James Abnett McNeill Whistler did was this one. This is called Harmony in Blue and Gold, subtitled The Peacock Room. And this was a dining room that he was commissioned to redesign by this London ship owner named Frederick Leyland. Right, so it's this London house, the dining room of the house, and this ship owner, Frederick Leyland, who was kind of a shipping magnate, let's say, he had this collection of blue and white china that he valued, right? And he wanted Whistler to create a room that would showcase it. Now, Whistler kind of designs the room around this painting called The Princess from the Land of Porcelain. And you can see that he's created this, very beautifully designed room in this kind of blue and gold and green colors. Again, kind of using the color, sort of peacock-like colors there. Peacocks, by the way, were a real big thing during this period. We'll see them not only in the aesthetic movement, but there's examples a little bit in arts and crafts and definitely in Art Nouveau, that it's, just was like a trend during this period. And again, sort of emphasizes the exoticism of all of these ideas. So he creates this room, and what goes way over budget, and it's totally not at all what Leyland wants, right? Because if you look at the picture of the room, do you even notice the collection of blue and white porcelain? No, like you have to really look for it. And so there's this whole fight with Leyland and Whistler, and Leyland doesn't pay him as much as, like all of the overages of, wanting so much more because he went way over budget. Also, there's a rumor that Whistler might have slept with his wife, and so that's a whole thing. Anyway, it was kind of a mess, but eventually they sort of settled. And then when Leland dies, the room was purchased by an American industrialist, Charles Lang Freer, who had it reinstalled in his Detroit home, and then later bequeathed it to the Smithsonian. So actually, this room is now located in Washington, D.C. So here you can see the doors, right, which has these peacocks on it. And here you can see some images of, what a big deal it was when the American Freer bought the room and had it sort of shipped over to America. And so there was like huge newspaper articles about it. It was kind of a big deal. But anyway, if you get a chance to go to the Freer collection, right, which includes not only this, but lots of Asian and American art that was commissioned by or purchased by this guy. He you can see the peacock room. So there you have it. That's all for today.